And we're live, apparently. How is everyone doing? By the way, we're gonna do something a little bit different here today. Because, for those who didn't watch the last video, I established a website where people can talk under encrypted formats, but also unencrypted, about whatever they want, because I run the server. And so I'm going to be taking the prime questions off of the voice to text room on riot.renaissanceman.xyz. That is riot.renaissanceman.xyz. If you want a link, there's a link to renaissanceman.xyz in the description for this video. If you open it up and you open up the Riot server, create an account, and go on there, you will have a community full of people who are Catholic. We also have an Orthodox fellow and a Protestant fellow too. And you won't have to worry about Discord or anything storing chat logs because I own the server. And this is where I'm going to be getting the majority of the questions from. And if you can put them in the voice to text room when you log on there, that would be ideal. Thank you. So, it's been a while since I've been talking about the list of books here. The last one was Mr. Kaczynski's classic work. We still have another 20 to go through. We'll probably go through them all today. And we'll also answer questions along the way. It's going to be a pretty interesting list here. A lot of variation. A lot of things that you might not expect as well. So we're going to wait for some people to come in, but I will take questions to begin with. How does it feel living in the midst of a Maoist cultural revolution? Well, considering this is getting strangely few views, I think we're experiencing it currently. There's a lot I could say, but suffice to say there's a reason why I established this server. There has not been silence and capitulation. That is one thing that I'm certain of. People are actually starting to stand up to these people. One of the dioceses in Michigan actually wrote a formal statement condemning the Black Lives Matter What We Believe section. So it's not nearly as straightforward as one would think. Not to mention that there have been famous people in Britain who have been condemning parts of the movement. It's all over the place. It's not really quite as clear cut as you might think. I just want to grill. Yeah, that is the correct opinion right there, Mongoose. We just want to grill. So, in the absence of other people, if you could please share this as well, that would be great. We will begin with the 16th book, which is Learn Python the Hard Way by Zed Shaw. Now, I decided to put this down not because it's necessarily an amazing book, but because it taught me Python. And Python, for those who don't know, is a programming language for just pretty much any computer that runs the interpreter. And it's an incredibly useful tool. I use it for many things. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation in Python, actually. It's an incredibly versatile, if quite slow, language. But this book here was what taught me it initially. I sat in my room, I must have been about 16, for 3 days straight, and just hammered out the book. And I haven't really looked back since. Really, very useful book. And so, I know that there was a fellow on the Discord server who was interested in learning Python, and that was the book that I have said that I would mention. So if you want to start with Python, you should go for Learn Python the Hard Way by Zed Shaw. It's really pretty good. Okay, let's continue. Sorry, I thought I'd just seen something on the Riot server. The second book that I'm going to mention today is Berlin, The Downfall, 1945 by Anthony Beevor. So for those who don't know who Anthony Beevor is, he was the guy who wrote the very famous Stalingrad book, which was a very big thing in Britain. I don't know if it was a big thing in America, but he essentially told the story of the Battle of Stalingrad through different accounts from soldiers on the ground, civilians, and, just generic history. He's quite I wouldn't say right-wing, but certainly conservative figure in Britain. The Russians were really not keen on the way that he portrayed them in the book here, Berlin, the Downfall, 1945. Because you don't often hear much about this when you read about history relating to the fall of the Third Reich. But he goes into quite a bit of detail about the refugees fleeing from the Soviets as they invaded Eastern Germany and Western Poland, or what is now Western Poland. He often goes into very, very striking detail, in fact, detailing all of the, well, maybe not all of the atrocities, but he goes over the atrocities that Soviet troops inflicted on people in East Germany. There was even an instance where a couple of refugee ships got sunk by Soviet submarines in the Baltic Sea that he goes on about. He talks about them, just all of the intricate parts of the ship sinking and everything. He talks about all kinds of very strange things that don't really exist nowadays in the East. So, for example, the Polish, what would now be called in modern Poland, the German ruling class in what is now part of Poland but was once East Prussia, and how they reacted to the Soviet advance, and about one particular gentleman who essentially refused to submit to the Gauleiter, who was the Nazi official in charge of I think it was the locality, I don't think it was actually a specific town where he was involved in, and how he fled from the Soviets and saved a lot of men. A lot of very, very small details, like no one really talks about the SS Werwolf, which was an attempt for the Nazis to establish guerrilla fighters behind Soviet lines. It goes into a lot of detail, and although it's unabashedly anti-communist and perhaps biased, as the Russian historians would suggest, it's certainly a very entertaining book, and so I'd recommend it. Let's see if we've got any questions in on here. Okay. Right. Can non-Catholics join the server? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, join the server. Trouble is that the last 40 years or so, okay, this is just stuff about the issues that are going on at the moment. Right, let's continue with the list. Number 18. Churchill, Hitler and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan. Now, this is actually quite pertinent right now, because there's a lot of people who are saying Churchill was a hero, and a lot of people saying that Churchill was a villain, and in this book, Pat Buchanan makes it really clear that Churchill was really not a particularly nice fellow. In fact, Pat Buchanan, probably because of his paleo-conservative leanings, depicts Churchill as very neoconish. It's very much somebody who was pushing war with Germany prematurely. And some people nowadays take that as if he was a kind of John the Baptist. Pete Hitchens actually wrote about this in his book on the Second World War. The Abolition of Victory, I think it was called. Was it called that? I can't remember exactly what it's called. Anyway, he talks about it to a lesser extent, but Pat Buchanan really lays into Churchill in huge detail, in very surprising levels of detail, talking about how Churchill fought against the Boer and in Sudan. In fact, he describes how Churchill thought that one of the most exhilarating times while he was in the military was fighting against the Mahdi's soldiers in Sudan, or at least I believe it was them, and fighting as a lancer, like killing a bunch of them, right? Pat Buchanan really portrays him as this bloodthirsty, almost Hillary Clinton-esque kind of figure. And I think it's really good because it balances out the real view of who Churchill is. Because Churchill's a myth in Britain, right? There's a reason why people are getting very, very angry about people trying to tear down statues. And I mean, truly, truly angry, right? You wouldn't see it from the media, but there are a lot of incredibly angry people who are getting more and more vocal over the statue thing over here. And it kind of rehumanizes Churchill as opposed to making him this sort of myth. Now, when he talks about Hitler, it's very typical, but likewise, he gives enough detail to Hitler to make him not this kind of Satan figure. Because when people discuss Hitler nowadays, they're not really talking about a person as much as they're talking about an idea. And the details that they provide, that Pat Buchanan provides of him, reminds us that he was indeed a human being. For example, when Chamberlain met him in the Berghof, that's towards the end of the book. He also talks at length about the First World War, indeed. How Churchill was very, very involved in that. A Portuguese infiltrator asks, I heard this book is one of the least biased pre-World War II books, is it? Well, I mean, every book has inherent bias in it, aside from, the scriptures, right? But it's a supremely detailed book. It's very, very good. If you find time to listen through it, I certainly didn't regret listening through it, on the recommendation of Coach Red Pill, actually. It's really detailed, and I'd recommend it. It just humanizes so much of the struggle with the First and Second World War, which has kind of been mythologized by the current secular elite as an almost, and admittedly a very flimsy creation myth for the modern world. Number 19, Skin in the Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Now, I really like Nicholas Nassim Taleb because he's very blunt in the way he writes. And this was the first book of his I ever listened through. I actually listened through it in the gym. And in this, he talks about connections to, Skin in the Game, right? It's in the title, right? I'm going to say connections to specific things. Human motivation and how that impacts on how people react and how we should govern business relationships and risk. I mean, that's his big thing. The one thing that did bug me a little bit is that at one point he's talking about the attempted assassination of Pope St. John Paul II in, I think it was 1988. And he says, well, if they really believed their religion, wouldn't they just pray for him instead of sending him to a hospital? And, just being really bugged by that. But it illustrated... I do remember that it illustrated the point that he was making quite well, if you really forced it. Likewise, he also talks about the Christological controversies, which is really surprising out of someone like Taleb, right? Because you wouldn't really be caught dead in the average sociology school or business school talking about the Christology of, the 4th through the 7th centuries AD. People, if you called someone an Aryan, they'd just give you a funny look and they'd say, was that something to do with the Nazis? If you called them a monophyllite, they might, just kind of look at you like, what's that? You'd have to explain, well, it's to do with the wills of Christ. Right? But he talks about this and he uses it to emphasize what he's trying to teach very well. I probably need to re-listen through it because it's been so long and it's very intricately complex and also profoundly entertaining because he's very, very, very blunt, Taleb. Right, let's go on. I'm trying to kind of keep this. I'm trying to keep these descriptions as quick as possible because we still have 16 books to go through and a lot of it, I mean, the last stream that we did on this took about an hour and 10 minutes. And so I want to kind of keep it kind of quick. Just going to quickly check the social media. Alright, so the next book is The Life of St. Cuthbert by St. Bede the Venerable. Now, many people have heard of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. But St. Bede the Venerable also wrote, I believe, 2 lives of the life of St. Cuthbert, or at least 2 lives of St. Cuthbert exist. The prose one and the poetic one. I'm talking about the prose life of St. Cuthbert, and it talks about one of the most important saints in English history, I suppose you call it, although England didn't exist. Now, St. Cuthbert was a monk that lived in the 7th century in Britain during some mighty controversies, in fact. Britain was in the midst of conversion, or reconversion, to the Orthodox Roman Catholic faith. And there were many disputes, not only with the still kind of latent paganism in the countryside, and St. Bede illustrates this very well. He talks about the monks going out into the wilderness to talk to the normal people like someone emerging from a vault in Fallout. It's actually very... There's something strangely comforting about it. It seems very relatable. Because you're reading through it, and you're reading the relationship between Cuthbert and these monks, and also his time when he was a hermit, and when he saw the life of another saint lifted up into the sky, kind of like St. Anthony saw. And you're reading about this kind of wholesome, and then they go out into the countryside, which is filled with a really uncatechized people. Because he was living up around Lindisfarne, and in Northumbria, in Britain, which had very recently converted at the behest of their king, St. Oswald. And so you've got a bunch of people who have just been re-Christianized, but they don't really know what's going on. And some of them are still kind of involved with the paganism. They don't really know what's going on, and it really does seem like he's heading out into this very barbaric kind of world. And Bede sets this up very well, and it seems very relevant to today. It's also chock full of miracles, right? And you've got to remember, Bede was only living about, I think, maybe 2 generations after Cuthbert died. Bede himself was a Northumbrian monk. He wasn't at Lindisfarne, he was at one of the other ones. But he was still living in a similar environment. And I loved this work simply because it illustrated that, as well as telling the story of a very great and very blessed saint. The second thing that I was going to mention that's important is that there was a kind of a clash in Britain at this time over the different monastic rules and the different rites, because in Britain, before the return of St. Augustine of Canterbury, who returned to Britain in 597 AD to re-Christianize Britain, the only massively Christian part, well, the only massive Christian influence on Britain were the Irish monks. And so there was this Irish rite of monasticism, and I think they probably also had their own masses. In fact, I know they had their own masses because of what happened. This Christianity had permeated its way around the British Isles, and Cuthbert lived under the Irish rite. But as the Roman rite came back, because Augustine of Canterbury was sent directly by Gregory the Great to re-Christianize Britain, there were clashes, understandably, between the two rites, and so they corrected this at the Synod of Whitby. And Cuthbert was alive for all of this. It's one of the lesser covered parts of English history, right? You often hear about the 100 Years' War, or maybe to a lesser extent the War of the Roses. You hear about Henry VIII, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and you hear about the English Civil War and the more contemporary English history. But you never really hear about the time between the Romans left, which was in 410 AD, and the establishment of the Kingdom of England by Alfred in, I think it was 887 after the Battle of Edington. This 400-year period is very often not well taught. You don't really hear much about the 7 kingdoms of Britain. You had Essex, Kent, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Strathclyde, I think it was. And you don't really learn much about that. And this is one of those texts that came out at that time. St. Bede the Venerable wrote about this in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, although he was in that period himself. Also, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle goes over it, and I mean, St. Bede the Venerable wrote a lot. A lot of it isn't translated. unfortunately, and I think that might be a good task for anyone who knows Latin. He also wrote A Life of St. Wilfrid, which I never really got into as much. I just found The Life of St. Cuthbert a lot nicer. Man, I've gone on about The Life of St. Cuthbert for quite a while. Yeah, for those who have just joined, I am taking most of the questions from the voice-to-text room on the Renaissance Man Riot. That can be found in your browser at riot.renaissancemen.xyz. That is riot.renaissancemen.xyz. You can find the link to the website renaissancemen.xyz in the description. If you load that up in another tab and click the link for the Riot server, you will be able to access that, and then you can go ahead and join and get primacy in the questions. Right, so have we got any questions? Are these in any particular order of recommendation? No, they aren't. Just books that I like, really. I didn't really give it much conscious thought. If you want to hear the first few books, I had another stream a while ago about it. So that would be things like The Confessions of St. Augustine and Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Okay, so the third... Oh wait, actually, we've got another question here. The Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy was in England, not Britain. Well, yeah, that's why I excluded the Welsh kingdoms like Gwynedd and Gwyfford. I know it was in England. Did I say Britain? My mistake. Strathclyde also had part of England though. It controlled Carlisle, from what I remember. That's why I included Strathclyde. I know it was also a Brythonic-speaking people as well. Or was it Germanic? Either way, they were Britons. They were definitely Britons in Strathclyde. Okay, let's continue with the list. The next recommendation is Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Now, this is probably the book that converted me, to be honest. His way of describing materialism in a section called The Maniac is one of those texts that, if it were licit to have it tattooed on me, I would get it tattooed. That and the Book of Ecclesiastes. Because it just illustrates the problem with the modern world so well, right? He says, this is something that you should bring up whenever someone tells you to believe in yourself, right? You know, the only people who believe in themselves are people in asylums, right? Because when you believe in yourself, this isn't what G.K. Chesterton says, this is what I'm kind of paraphrasing. When you believe in yourself, you're trapped in yourself, because you view yourself as the highest good. And this encloses you with an increasingly small circle. And you're also trapped with your imperfections, and because you take them as the highest good, then you just follow along your imperfections and end up in a fantasy land that doesn't exist. Does that sound familiar, guys? He goes through that, and he also did this in his previous work, which was kind of related to this Heretics, where he singles out specific people, including George Bernard Shaw. He just goes after and really lays into this progressive mindset of the early 20th century, the 1900s, right? Which was very similar to what we see in the modern day, except in the modern day we kind of take it as a given. The difference nowadays is that there are certain people who hold this to be true, but then they will still react in accordance with reality, and there are those that don't. And the left are the ideologically consistent ones. It's such a good book. I need to really reread it. It's such an important book. It's also a really funny read as well. Okay, let's see if there's been anything new. No. Okay. The next book, Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Now, Ernst Junger is someone that I actually read for the Renaissance Man program when it was running. And I read his book on pain. Which really isn't about pain, but it does illustrate some of the problems of the modern world and the way it approaches warfare. But he wrote a lot of really strange kind of Nietzschean conservative books, right? Because he was of his time, of course, like all of us. Because most of his books were written in the 1920s and 1930s, just before Hitler took power, in fact, he wrote a book called Der Arbeiter as well, which was also channeling this thought. He sort of took Nietzsche for granted in those works, and they're a little bit cringe. But Storm of Steel is this very candid, very unemotional account of his from the First World War, even, where he was a stormtrooper, and it goes into such a level of detail. In fact, people used to attack it because it wasn't anti-war enough. They said he was very pro-war, Junger, and I can't say that I got that impression from his book, but he certainly isn't. He certainly isn't one of these war is hell types. He just kind of presents it how it is, and that's what I really liked about it. Right, so one part of the book is he's crossing over to an already taken French trench, and he's looking at the bodies of the French that have been killed in this trench, the French in the trench, and he talks about these I suppose they're probably suffering rigor mortis by this point, if I remember correctly, but Frenchmen with their heads missing but with their arms still fixed in position where they were holding their labelled rifles. He goes into this really deep detail. At one point he finds his brother seriously injured and rescues him and saves his life, in fact. But he goes into such detail, and it doesn't have all of this war is hell nonsense that's kind of shoved down your throat, right? Because there are a lot of the time they'll embellish the brutality of war in these books, right? You have the famous example is All Quiet on the Western Front, which I haven't read, but I know enough of to know it's kind of like this. But he doesn't do this. It's quite a breath of fresh air, right? It's not overly glorifying war, like perhaps the Lord Kitchener view of war, or maybe the Teddy Roosevelt view of war. But it's not overly damning it either, like Wilfred Owen or someone like that. I'd say it was pretty neutral. While also being very detailed. Right, let's see. Any questions? Right, let's continue. Also, guys, if you could please share this. It seems like either people aren't interested in books, which is a plausible state of affairs, or YouTube is suppressing it. Because I've got much lower numbers than I'm used to. Number 23, De Regno by St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, I'm going to do both of these. Because the next book is also by St. Thomas Aquinas. There's De Regno and the Summas, which are the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles. But we'll start with De Regno. De Regno is on kings or on princely government. I actually recorded it for the Renaissance Man program, which you can get in the Patreon, as well as supporting the website. De Regno, it sets out a very, very good argument for how countries should be run, as well as the types of government that are used. And Aquinas very convincingly argues that monarchy is the best form of government. It's also a very moralistic work, which wouldn't surprise you if you knew who St. Thomas Aquinas was, but it might surprise people nowadays, because political philosophy isn't really viewed as a matter of morals, which is ridiculous, because I can't imagine anything more moral than politics. He doesn't quite go to the crazy extreme of the Republic by Plato or any of these modern radicals who really are just kind of unbalanced, right? I know that Plato's perfect view of government was better expressed in his work on laws, but it's very extreme in the Republic. Aquinas, kind of like his international predecessor, his intellectual predecessor Aristotle, take a very comparatively balanced view, and they talk in terms of practicalities and in terms of the ruler himself. He spends a ton of time talking about the ruler himself, right? His moral character, what he should do, how he should act, and such. And that's very refreshing, I found, because a lot of the time they'll just say, oh, we need to change this law to deal with X moral wrong, and somehow this is going to solve it. No, that's not how politics works. It's not how leadership works. And likewise, ideology is largely irrelevant as well. It's a lot more praxis-based at the De Reino, which is quite nice. Querty asks, how long is that one? I'm interested in his Just War theory. It's not very long at all. It was about 2 hours. It's about 2 hours on the Renaissance Man program, right? It's a relatively short read. I think it was about 50 pages. At least the book one that was included in my hardcover, very old copy of Aquinas' political writings. I know that the Just War theory one was Secunda Secundae Partis, question 40, right? And he goes over it in De Reino as well. There's also a number of other writings in that political treatise that I got. Actually, there's one on government of religious minorities that I won't name, but you can imagine it wasn't Muslims. And he's very he's actually very conciliatory, I thought. Let's see what the next... Oh yeah, the next one. The Summas, right? The Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles, these are very important books. Particularly nowadays, the Summa Contra Gentiles. Because we don't live in a Christian society anymore, and the Summa Contra Gentiles is... Well, it means the summary against the Gentiles. In other words, the nations, those who are outside of the church. Because you see, a lot of people think of Gentiles as being just people who aren't Ashkenazim or Mizrahim or Sephardim, but really the classical thinkers in Christianity and the patristics, and also Aquinas thought of the Jews in themselves as Gentiles because they were outside of the church. And likewise, he sets forth a number of articles relating to basic truths about the faith that should be taught against those other religions in contradiction of their views, right? This was before the time of, well, I mean, maybe not before the time of meta-narratives, but this was before the times where people would try and argue against religion through misdirection and through completely empty rhetoric. This was a time when words meant something. And so there's this very, very strong core of anti-non-Christian theology that's around that just needs to be read by people and understood. And the Summa Theologiae is also the same. These are both 13th century textbooks, basically. They're set up in such a format where Aquinas lists out the objections to a particular article. He provides his own answer, and then he responds to every single one of the objections. Which is a format that I think should return. What I would say is that when reading these things, you don't really read them like a regular book, right? Many people will just sit and read a novel or something like that. This isn't how that works. What you do is that when you have a particular problem or a particular question you want to answer, say for example on prayer, I found Aquinas' writing on prayer very, very helpful, right? So you want to do that, you look up the particular question in the particular part, and then you read it, and then you read through the objections to get an idea of what Aquinas is writing. Because not only do you get the positive definition of what Aquinas thinks relating to a certain thing, but you also get the objections outlawed, delineated out. And so not only do you constrain yourself through the objections being proven false, but you also got the core of a positive belief there as well, which is something that should return in modern books, but just doesn't exist at the moment, unfortunately. Alright, let's see. I have notifications and reminder on. YouTube didn't send one. Did YouTube not send them? You see, this is why I post them, perhaps annoyingly, to the community tab, because they don't tend to send out the notification. Issa Arello asks, hopefully you'll list these books. So far I'm adding them all to my wishlist. Cool. Let's continue with them then. So the next one is a recommendation from a friend of mine, The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Now this is a great book for children. It's sublime in its artwork. and it's very wholesome. It is indeed very wholesome. And I suggest that everyone read it to their children, alongside an illustrated Bible that isn't Protestant. That's just a wholesome edition. I thought that there needed to be a bit of lightening up, right? Because a lot of this is very dense academic stuff that you need to really process right. But you don't need to process the Very Hungry Caterpillar. It's just kind of wholesome reading. Okay, let's see if there are any questions about that. Yeah, see, I love that. Yeah, you see the people in the chat. Yeah, you see. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, guys. Okay, let's get on to something a bit more serious. The Rule of St. Benedict by St. Benedict. Now, this is a book that you're not going to really read in one sitting. It's like reading the book of Leviticus, right? It's a set of rules for running a monastery of maybe 12 people. But it's profoundly important for two reasons that I can think of. First of all, there's a list in that book of the different steps of humility. In fact, these are so important that Thomas Merton did about 7 hours of lectures on them. And as we all know, or as we should know, the levels of humility are basically where we sit in the spiritual life, right? The more humble you are, the better. And not this modern definition of humility. Humility is how far one will, hold to God's laws, right? So, for example, somebody who willfully commits mortal sins, but is not going to speak out against, something, is not a humble person just because they stay quiet. In fact, they're extremely arrogant by virtue of the fact that they're violating the moral law. Likewise, a very mouthy, or perhaps perceived to be mouthy person who does not sin is a profoundly humble person because they've completely submitted to God's law through not sinning. The second part is that it shows you what is necessary to build civilization, right? Because the Rule of St. Benedict, in a very real sense, rebuilt Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it's very dry. You'll realise reading this book that it's very much about the nuts and bolts. It's not about any profound ideas about saving the West or, somehow evangelising the entirety of society. It's things like, who's going to manage the wine? How are we going to pray every day? How is the leadership going to be coordinated? Such things as that. And it's really nice because he does this. It doesn't have this kind of arrogant flair that people have when they say they're going to save the West. And in fact, that's a lot of the reason why I've stayed mostly quiet on politics. Because there are a lot of people who are very interested in talking about the West and talking about high ideas, but they really can't do anything. Right? Now I'll do stuff. I've gone and established this website because I think it's important to communicate. Right? But there's no sense talking about high-minded ideas of freedom of speech if you're just going to sit there and bluster. And Benedict realised this. In fact, Benedict made this rule in response to a rather caustic reception from some monks that tried to kill him because he was too austere. And he decided that he'd just make a rule that would save people but wouldn't drive people too nuts, right? Now, if you read it nowadays, it's pretty austere, right? The morning prayers were 12 psalms. Now, for reference, in the morning when I do Matins and Lauds, there are 7 psalms actually. 7 psalms / canticles, right? And there are 3 specifically in Matins, or the Office of Readings, right? He had a lot more. He's also pretty nice with the level of eating, right? Because you've got to remember that when Benedict was making this rule, he was using mostly writings from the Desert Fathers, which, funnily enough, is the next one we're going to talk about. And these were very, very brutal, right? You'd have people like St. Anthony not eating for 5 days. The trouble is that doesn't really work in Italy, where Benedict was, Benedict of Nursia. In fact, there's one story of a bunch of monks that tried to follow this Egyptian rule on Mount Athos, and they ended up dying because they weren't adequately warm. Because, of course, Egypt is a very warm place, so you don't really need to necessarily eat as much. But in Italy, or what would have been called Gaul, what is now France, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, Belgium and the Netherlands, and in Britain, where this rule spread, and in fact, this spread across all of Western Europe, it's not feasible to not eat for 5 days because you'll just freeze. And so he made it in response to that. In fact, he actually prescribes reading some of these fathers' writings, specifically John Cassian. So it's a very, very good text. And as we continue, I've actually just tabbed up the list here. The 27th book on this list is The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, translated by Benedict Ward. Now, this was compiled in the 17th century by a Jesuit priest, I believe, the Apologia Patrum, I think it's called, in the Latin. But it's actually part of a much, much larger collection of writings, which is known as the Evangelios in Greek. And this has recently been translated by, I think it's the Institute of Traditionalist Orthodox Studies or something, right? But this is a very small part, and it's a set of small stories and small sayings from various desert fathers, right? So you have St. Anthony, as I've mentioned, St. Macarius, you have St. Moses the Black. There's even one from St. Ephraim the Syrian. And they're related and categorized based on things that a monk or any good Christian really has to acknowledge, right? So dealing with lust, discretion, dealing with visions and such. And it's the first spiritual writing I really picked up and really started meditating on. And it's changed me for the better. Granted, you will start doing things that are much in excess of St. Benedict's rule if you take the sayings of the Desert Fathers for granted. For example, I suspect that most people who have a real spiritual life nowadays and are formed based on that and similar writings like the Philokalia, they'll often be fasting a lot harder than the Benedictines would. Right? I know I have done that because I started with the sayings of the Desert Fathers. And granted, I was nowhere near the state where it was like, you're not going to eat you're not going to eat for 5 days, right? But it was certainly harsher than what Benedict proposed. And it is indeed useful to do that, right? Because it controls the passions. But it's not necessarily feasible in the UK as opposed to Egypt or Libya or the Holy Land. But it's still nonetheless good reading. Right, let's continue. Someone just asked me to go into a chat. Okay, the next writing is the Early Christian Writings by Penguin. Now, if I had one book that I could give to Protestants, specifically low church Protestants, it would be this. Because not only does it argue very strongly for bishops, right, because it has the epistles of St. Ignatius of Antioch, but it also talks about the various forms of baptism and how it's really only to be administered once in the Didache. So this is a collection of different writings from the 2nd century mostly, of the very earliest of the Christian saints. So you have Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a disciple of St. John the Evangelist. You have St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was supposedly held by Christ, in fact. You have Clement of Rome's epistle, which is another very good one. And you've got the Didache, and there are a bunch of other things. Either way, this is a very nice compilation that it's good to have it on hand, because it shows especially the prime importance of bishops, which, as we all know, the Presbyterians, of course, reject, what pretty much all low church Protestants reject. And so you can kind of move people out of that, because you can say, well, look, the earliest Christian churches, were incredibly insistent on obeying the bishops as if the bishops were Christ, and you don't even have bishops. So why are you there? It's also good because it enlightens you on how things were going in the 2nd century in a society that was, well, mostly pagan, very, very slightly Jewish in some places, right, but not very Christian. And the next book. Oh, so there's a question. What would you say is the best way to find a good traditional Catholic church in a new town where you don't know anyone? Just go to your local parish. You see, the thing is that if you go to these traditional churches, you will meet people who are influenced by traditional Catholics online, and that's not necessarily a road that you want to be treading down, because there are a lot of people who are trad, but they have tendencies in their spiritual lives that you don't want to fall under the influence of. And I'm not going to name any names, but there are some very prominent people involved with the trads that are, I think, are profoundly spiritually unhealthy, and I think you should avoid like the plague. Traditional Catholic circles have always seemed very female-centered for me. Yeah, most Catholic circles are, because it's mostly women, right? It's mostly women, and a lot of them are on an ego trip, as I well know. Okay, speaking of women, the next one I'm going to recommend is a book published by St. Vladimir's Press, which is an Eastern Orthodox publisher in the US, called The Letters of St. Olympia, The Letters to St. Olympia by St. John Chrysostom. So some context. St. Olympia was a very close female friend of St. John Chrysostom, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, he was removed from office by a synod called the Synod of the Oak, which is a false synod, right? He was persecuted by the synod because he didn't get on very well with the emperor's wife, mostly because he called out her impurity and her arrogance. Was it her impurity? I don't think it was her impurity, actually. I think it was like her money grubbiness. Otherwise, she was causing problems, and so she dealt with St. John Chrysostom. And St. John Chrysostom died on this exile because he was forcibly moved through all of Turkey, through barbarian lands. Like, for example, a lot of people don't know that central Turkey, under the Romans, was never really that civilized. They still had barbarian raids from barbarians living inside of Turkey up until the 5th century, the Isaurians. In fact, one of them became emperor for a little bit. An Arian emperor. I think he was Arian, wasn't he? He was either Arian or Monophysite. I can't remember which one. The one before Anastasius. Yeah, so he was moving through Asia Minor, and he's talking to Olympia, who's losing her mind because her best friend basically has been kicked out. He's been tarred and feathered, and there are a lot of very angry people. And so St. John Chrysostom writes these long letters that console her and talk about the scriptures, and they are beautiful. In fact, it's the first book since Of Mice and Men that I've actually cried reading. Right? And I read, and admittedly, Of Mice and Men was very cheap. This was not cheap. This is like one of the heftiest books I've ever read. And it also points out some things very beautiful. For example, St. John Chrysostom would probably have been in very strong support for clerical celibacy in the West. I can conclude this based on his writing because he praises it so heavily. He actually goes almost over the top, I think, and he acknowledges at one point, he kind of goes on a digression because he's talking about Job for pages and pages, and then he goes, oh wait, I'm off kilter, right? And it's a very beautiful work, and it's well worth the price of admission. I'll be back in a second. I'm just going to quickly sort a few things. Alright, let's have a look. So the next book is The Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. Now, this may have been written by a Jewish rabbi in the 1st century, but it's one of the most important writings to Christianity. Full stop. And it's a big, big writing. A big, I think it's 20 books in total. 4 volumes. And it goes through history from creation until, I believe, the wake of the Jewish war with Rome. And it's profoundly interesting. He adds all kinds of details that were probably present in the rabbinical tradition, but weren't present in the scriptures. For example, Moses had 2 wives. Moses was a general fighting for Pharaoh. And he invaded, I think, what would have been called modern-day Sudan. And he took one of the cities, and one of the princesses there married him because she was kind of wooed by the fact that he came along with a big army. There are lots of little details like that. It's really, really entertaining. Well, interesting you should mention that, George, because one of the people who cites Josephus the most, a writer called Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, has a letter that he claims was written by Christ to the king of Armenia called Ahijah, which doesn't really add much it doesn't actually add anything to the doctrines, and it probably wasn't even written by him, but it's very interesting. He did apparently write stuff though. Right, Ash Ketchum asks, what's your opinion about learning some topic for the sake of learning, even if it's contrary to virtuous life and society? Well, I tried to do this with public relations. I tried to sit down and read Edward Bernays' Contrary to Virtuous Life, and you know what it did? It just scandalised me, because it made me angry, because I don't especially like what Bernays was up to. In fact, I think what Bernays was up to was incredibly evil. So I wouldn't recommend it. Although it's important to know about these influences. Actually, I'm going to go grab water. I should have grabbed water while I was out, but never mind. Just 2 seconds. I'll leave the mic unmuted. Yeah, sorry about that. Right, so the next one after this is Can't Hurt Me, Master Your Mind and Defy the Odds by David Goggins. Now this and the book by Jocko Willink, which I still haven't finished, are some of the best books that are written nowadays. Because they tell stories while also telling of virtue. Right? So you have David Goggins, a man who was profoundly abused as a kid. Very weak. Actually very, very overweight. More overweight than I've ever been. Going from that to a Navy SEAL in about 3 months. And it's incredibly inspiring, and he explains how he did it. And you know what he did? He just sucked it up. And it shows how much power there is in just sucking it up. And how much capacity human beings actually have to suck it up. In fact, he says that we only... Our perceived pain threshold is only about 40% of what it actually is. We can always do more. We can always push ourselves harder. And that was how he was able to lose 100 pounds in 3 months. And become a Navy SEAL. It's a really, really incredible story. And the guy is... He lives a... He'd be an incredible monk. Right? He'd be an absolutely incredible monk. He's one of these people that if he were Christian, which he isn't, he would be among the Desert Fathers and the way he lives, right? Because he runs a marathon every day, pretty much. Right? He did something ridiculous like 10,000 pull-ups on TV. Right? He's this person who just has so much drive, and I'm someone who is pretty driven relative to the people around me, but like I ain't got nothing on that. And reading about people like that, it just gives you so much energy, and I think that's something that's needed today. So Ash Ketchum asked, but learning what evil does and how it behaves doesn't make me ready for whatever tricks they may pull. It doesn't make you ready for what they're going to pull, right? But it also gives you the temptation of using it, which is a very real problem with something like Bernays. I'm not going to name the book that I read. I'm going to say this for definite though. It's not propaganda, because that's the big one, and in itself it's not the full story of that book. But there are more brutal ones that he wrote. The next one is The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. And I'd also add in the place of this, because I've read this since I made the first video, I'd add The Great Heresies by Belloc. In fact, actually, yeah, I'll talk about both. Because Belloc is a very good writer. I'd argue that in a lot of ways he's actually better than Chesterton. Right? Because he's a lot blunter. He doesn't muck around. So, let's start with The Servile State. So, in this book, he points out that then modern, I think he was writing sometime in the early 20th century, I think it was the 1910s. He points out that modern capitalism is destined to recreate the slave states of the Roman Empire. A lot of people who he actually believed in wage slavery, right? He believed that the wages that are paid in factories or paid in coffee shops or whatever are equivalent to slavery, and I agree with him. I agree with him very strongly, actually, the more I read of it. And he proposes that there are essentially two alternatives, right? There is everything being in public possession, in other words, really held by the state, which would be communism. Or there's distributism, where the means of production are handed out to as many people as possible. Or at least it's set up in such a way that the most people possible have possession of the means of production, as opposed to it being publicly owned. And that's distributism. And he goes over that in this, as well as various details of the fact that our economic system is very pagan. And this was, bear in mind, written 100 years ago. And frankly, nothing has really changed. We paint like a nice face over it. We add perhaps a flag with 6 colours as opposed to the normal 7. And we do protests, and we do a lovely parade, a fabulous parade. But it doesn't change the reality. It just kind of seems nice, right? But it's the same exploitation. It's just that people are working in McDonald's instead of the Cadbury's factory now. Right. And as for the Great Heresies, the great thing about the Great Heresies is that it doesn't go into this kind of axiomatic formal argumentation that something like Alphonsus Liguori's book on heresies does. Right? Because when you hear the Great Heresies, you're expecting a book that goes over the Great Heresies and explains why they're wrong in a logical fashion. And although this would be a good book, and St. Alphonsus Liguori did this in much greater detail than Belloc ever could, or ever would, the Great Heresies itself is actually a more useful book in a lot of ways to the average layperson, because it explains the mindset behind not only the founders of 5 particular heresies, but also the societal currents at the time. Now, the 5 heresies that he goes over are Arianism, which is the belief that Christ wasn't divine and he was the only begotten Son of God, but he wasn't equal to God in essence. Islam, which was actually a Christian heresy. St. Sophronius of Jerusalem, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, wrote about it in such terms, and so did St. John of Damascus. Then he goes over Catharism, or Albigensianism, which was this strange Gnostic heresy that was in southern France in the 13th century, but it also came from the Byzantine Empire, specifically the Paulicians in Bulgaria. This strange Gnostic group. He goes over that and he talks about the tendency for humanity to sort of delineate between good and evil and overemphasize evil, and giving it like actual being. Protestantism, specifically the more reformed versions of Protestantism, so John Calvin, Theodore Beza, John Knox, I suppose you'd say Jacob Arminius to an extent. And then he goes over what he calls Antichrist, or as we know it, modernism. And he talks about the socioeconomic circumstances, the heresiarchs themselves. So he talks about Arius, Muhammad, who was the one who did Catharism. I can't remember I don't think he mentioned anyone for Catharism, actually. And then he talks about the Protestant reformers. And he also talks about how the line between Protestant reformer and Catholic was actually blurred up until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which is very interesting. But yeah, in fact, I'd argue that The Great Heresy is probably a more important book for the average person than The Servile State, but they're still very good books, both of them. Let's see. The Macallan asks, could universal basic income be considered a form of distributism? No. Because giving people money is not the same as giving them the means of production. Right, so the means of production are things like hammers, tools for making things. The ability to produce, objects. So, for example, this computer that I'm sitting in front of, that would be a means of production, because I'm able to broadcast my voice to you and this picture of the Greek philosophers to the end of charging ad revenue if you guys don't have ad block. Do you have any books on how to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women? I did mention the Very Hungry Caterpillar, so that would be a good example. Right. So let's continue, because we're taking quite a while. I think we've been going for an hour, haven't we? Yeah, we'll continue for the very last few books, because we've got 4 left. We have... Actually, give me a second. Sorry about that. The next book we have on the list is the Lausiac History, the Lausiac, Lausiac History by Palladius. And this is another collection of stories about the Desert Fathers. Now, Palladius was writing a history for, Lausius, I think his name was, who was an important official in Constantinople, who was very interested in developing his Christian life. And so Palladius went down to the desert and wrote down his life and times in the desert with the different ascetics. So this includes, like I've said, stories about Anthony, Moses, Paul the Hermit, Didymus the Blind. There's a lot of them, and it's very, very interesting. It's one of those. I think I did part of it for the Renaissance Man program, but because there was a great big event that kind of stopped it in its tracks, I never got around to finishing it. I might have to finish it at some point. It's a very, but I did read a good chunk of it. I read a good enough chunk to know it was really good. And I seem to remember skimming over the rest. Alright. The next book is The Gospel of John. Now, this is probably my favourite gospel. Because it's filled with Greek language, although there are some people, like I think his name was John Bergsma, who actually said that the Gospel of John was more filled with things that directly pertain to the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And frankly, I don't know enough of the topic to say whether it's either or both. But it's one of my favourite... It's my favourite Gospel because the very first chapter... The very first chapter is basically a proto-canon. In fact, I think that if I had control over the Novus Ordo Mass, I think one of the things I would add would be the reading of John 1 at the end. Because that's in the Tridentine Mass, and I think it's very useful for the sake of the laity, because it lays out in pretty uncertain terms what our attitude towards Christ ought to be. In profound detail. The second reason is... I'll go through 3 reasons. Why not? The second reason is I actually had pointed out to me that the wedding of Cana, which is in John chapter 3, is actually one gigantic metaphor for the growth into the kingdom of heaven, right? Through Mary, right? Because you have Mary go, they have no wine, and then Christ says, my hour has not yet come. And then he changes the water in the purification stone jars into wine, which is of course blood. So he's changed the water from the purification into the wine of purification, which is his blood. And then you have, of course, the steward. He drinks it and he says, you saved the best wine for last. And I mean, this is a very, very basic overview of it, but I think it's a very profound meditation when thinking of the wedding of Cana, to think that it's really just the whole spiritual life and eventual assumption into heaven in micro. And the third one is just the additional details that he gives on the crucifixion, right? Like the tetragrammaton being on Christ's cross and the Pharisees not being very happy about it. Mongoose Man asks, hey, I know this is totally off topic, but what do you think about the claims about pagan origins of Judaism? I assume you're talking about someone like Michael Coogan. Well, Dr. Michael Coogan also believes that Jonathan and David were homosexual lovers, which is ridiculous because it's condemned in the Law of Moses. Just because, and actually this was in the readings for the Office of Readings very recently, just because Jonathan loved David with his whole heart, with his whole will, doesn't mean that they were engaging in illicit acts. What it means is that Jonathan willed the entire full good of David. He wasn't infatuated with David, which is what the modern world seems to think love is. This infatuation that burns out. It wasn't. It's long-suffering. It's that ultimate willing of good. Right? Christ did not die on the cross so he wouldn't suffer. God died on the cross for our good, that we might be saved. He didn't die so that you wouldn't have to fast or follow some rule that you don't like. And likewise with Jonathan and David, he didn't like have the, for him. And it's saying, I think that this particular psalm is actually a psalm to the Baalim of the north, right? Okay. I'll tell you what, Dr. Coogan, I'll believe you when you stop holding very ridiculous points of view on things like the Book of Ezekiel, right? Like this, you've got me started now. Michael Coogan, who is this big Old Testament scholar, right? He says, the Old Testament contradicts itself because it says in Exodus chapter 20 that the sins will be upon the sons up to the 4th generation or something like that. And then, in Ezekiel chapter 7:14, it says that the only person that dies from the sin is the person who commit the sin. Yes, they don't contradict because there is culpa and pena, right? Culpa being the culpability from sin, and pena being the pain that is caused by imperfection in the world, right? And pena in itself isn't a bad thing, right? Because an antelope has to suffer pain when a lion eats it. Likewise, you might suffer because, your parents may get divorced, but there's no culpability on your part. That is what is meant by the sons suffering from the 3rd to 4th generation as a result of those sins of the elder, right? Because the culpability has material, painful consequences. In fact, that's where the word pain comes from, pena, which is Latin for penalty, right? But the culpability is only with the person who commits it. These don't contradict each other. So if you're gonna take the word of someone who cannot make a basic distinction that has been present in Christianity for thousands of years, and will instead use some sort of ridiculous argument like that to somehow undermine the infallibility of Scripture, which is really is a cop-out, right? Like, I think that Bart Ehrman has better arguments for the New Testament being non-infallible than Coogan does for the Old Testament in that relation, right? At least come up with something better. Please, just at least come up with something better, right? And it says, well, there's similarities between the Ugaritic religion of North Canaan. It's like, well, okay, but if you're going to make such flagrantly ignorant observations about Scripture, then why should I believe you on the origins of that Scripture? Why should I listen to you over the people who believe that the book of Deuteronomy was written by Josias? The people who have just all of a sudden kind of faded out of existence. Because this was a big theory at the beginning of the 20th century, but it isn't now. Alright. Okay, what are the best ways to practice chastity and avoid lust? Fast, read Scripture, pray more, and avoid the occasion. So stop looking at immodest women, I guess. Those are the 4 ways. Okay, the next one, and the penultimate one, Computer Networks by Andrew S. Tannenbaum. Now, I like Tannenbaum's writings on tech, because without Tannenbaum we wouldn't have Torvalds and we wouldn't have Linux, and Linux is profoundly useful. But I specifically choose his book on computer networks because it's just a big compilation of how the entirety of the OSI network system works. Right? Now, I know this is mostly a humanities channel, but I mean, I'm deeply involved in computing. Right? I've just graduated with my degree in computer science. Right? And I'm probably there's a significant chance that I'm going to be going into a master's in some form of artificial intelligence, right? So I read a lot into these things, and I think that if you're going to be reading about computer networks, Andrew S. Tannenbaum is a really good start. What are your thoughts on Origin and the argument that reincarnation is biblical? What's like the pre-existence of souls and apocastasis? Well, apocastasis was condemned by the third count. Well, actually, most of the views of Origin like that, the pre-existence of souls and apocastasis, were condemned by the Third Council of Constantinople in the middle of the 6th century. Now you have people like David Bentley Hart and his revisionist translation of the New Testament arguing for apocastasis, and saying that, well, for those who don't know, apocastasis is that eventually every intelligent being will redeemed and will enter heaven because God is so good. So hell is not eternal, basically, and even the demons will reach heaven. Now, of course, the problem with this is that would require God to overpower the free will of both the demons and men, which would be to fundamentally compromise a faculty that God saw was extremely good in man. So you're forcing someone against their will to go to heaven, which would fundamentally undermine what makes man good. As for the pre-existence of souls, I assume that means that all souls already existed in the mind of God. Well, I mean, that means that human beings aren't related to their bodies, which has a lot of really serious problems with Christology, right? Because then that means that Christ... That would mean that Christ's human soul was pre-existent, which would... And it would also mean that... It would also add, like, all sorts of weird connotations to, he took on flesh and dwelt among us, right? It would seem to break Orthodox Christology pretty hard, as well as break the fact that male and female, he created them, right? Because it's very clear that the immaterial part of man, which is the soul, is unconnected by the body, and sex is determined by body. So you wouldn't. Why would you have a male and a female soul? This sounds very New Agey, and in fact, a friend of mine had a PhD candidate who was studying Origen, and she found evidence that Origen was talking to yogis. This is a pretty sophisticated. Yeah. Okay, let's continue. The final one is the Platonic Dialogues by Aristes. Now, Plato is actually not Plato's name. Plato's real name was Aristes. Plato was his boxing name. It's like Sylvester Stallone writing his philosophical dialogues as Rocky. You see, now I think that people should read these because they are the basis of pretty much all Western thought, including Aristotle. And it's really needed at the moment because people are just disconnected from logic. I'll answer that question because I'm going to speak about Platonic thought in very, very nebulous terms. Because there's so many of them. There's 2 volumes and I haven't read them all, but I know that Ion was very good. I found Euthyphro pretty good. Was it Crito? Yeah, I think it was Crito. The Apology, and I've read Republic. I listened through Republic. There's a bunch of other ones though. There's like the Laws. There's Timaeus. All of these things build up a metaphysical worldview, which is more than what we have nowadays, and they are the basis of subsequent thought. They're often very important to the early Christian fathers, like we've been mentioning, particularly Origen. How could Origen talk to a yogis? Right, so Origen was in Alexandria, and although it wasn't on the Red Sea, it was quite close to the Red Sea. And one of the things that went on in the Red Sea is that there were traders, and they would go along not only the Arabian coast but also along the Iranian, Pakistani, and Indian coasts. Now, what you have to remember with when Origen was alive in the 3rd century AD, if I remember correctly, so the 200s, is that you didn't have Islam. You had, in the east, from Persia, you had Zoroastrians, and you had Hinduistic religions. In fact, there was a Greek kingdom that carved gigantic Buddhas in Afghanistan. It's a very alien world when you think of it in these views, right? We often think of Roman legionaries and Greek hoplites, but we never really think of the fact that there may have been Greeks that practiced Hinduism in Afghanistan. But you didn't have the same locking off. Although Persia was at enmity with Rome, you had pretty secure trade routes along the Red Sea, past the Arabian Peninsula and down to India, and often there would be trade. And this would go both ways. So I imagine it wouldn't have been too hard to send correspondence. Now, if you asked me to find that evidence, I wouldn't be able to find it. But this is just an anecdote that I've gotten off of a professor. But yeah, apparently Origen interacted with Hindu yogis. Why isn't anything by Aristotle like the Metaphysics on the list? I think I mentioned him in the previous video. Did I? No, actually I didn't. Yeah, that's a fair point. The only books by Aristotle, the only book that I've finished by Aristotle in full was the Economics. I've heard parts of aspects of the metaphysics, the Nicomachean Ethics, and a bunch of others, but I never really sat down and cracked out Aristotle like I should. I've always been more interested in other books, so I never really put them down. Anyway, so that's all of the books. We'll take some questions for a bit. By the way, if you want to go on to... I've seen a person has done this. If you want to go on to riot.renaissanceman.xyz, we have a server for... well, basically so that you aren't going to be spied on by corporations. And that is where we're going to be coordinating a lot of the discussion. So, any final questions that I've missed? There's a couple of things on UBI that I missed in the chat, actually. I can see how the complacency could be a problem, although it depends on a person's character. UBI could be used... You know, I think that UBI is one of these things that will drive society even further into the ground. Because when you give someone $1,000 a month, they'll be like, why haven't you given me $2,000? Because people with money, they don't have any moderation. They don't go, thank you, I'm sufficient now. Now, I would, I think. I would like to think that I would be able to take my $1,000 a month and smile, considering that covers pretty much all my costs. But a lot of people won't. They'll be like, systematic oppression. I'm getting my $1,000 a month off of the government. Yet, you know, I don't have any opportunities. It's a lot better to just actually stimulate the economy. Because I've been going through Thomas Sowell's book, Basic Economics, recently, and he makes a very convincing case, and I believe this since before I listened to his book, that price is just an abstraction of, you know, supply and demand. So if you give people loads of money, the price will simply go up. And so UBI won't really solve anything. Thoughts on Dante? I think it's because I got a really poor copy, but I tried to read the Inferno and I just found it really boring. Anyway, we've been going on for nearly an hour and a half. I think I'm going to bring it to a close. Thanks everyone who tuned in, and don't forget to go on the Riot server at riot.renaissanceman.xyz. The link is in the description if you wish to join. And I'll see you later. Goodbye.